The night was cold and the city streets were almost empty. Daniel pulled his coat tight around his shoulders as he walked home from work. His shoes tapped softly on the wet pavement, echoing between the tall buildings. The street lamps flickered, weakly, throwing long shadows across the ground. Daniel had walked this path many times before, but tonight felt different. As he turned the corner, he noticed something strange in the alley to his right. At first he thought it was just another homeless person hiding from the cold, but then his eyes focused and he froze. The figure sitting on the ground was not like any human he had ever seen. She was thin, almost fragile, with skin that shimmered faintly like silver under the dim light. Her eyes glowed a soft pale blue, bright enough to shine even in the shadows. She looked weak, tired, and completely out of place. Daniel's first instinct was to step back. His heart beating faster, every part of him whispered to walk away, to pretend he hadn't seen anything. But something deep inside told him to stop. She was not dangerous, at least not in this moment. She looked lost, broken, and more than anything, she looked alone. The woman lifted her head slowly, and her glowing eyes met his. There was no anger in them, no threat, only exhaustion and fear. Her lips moved, but the sound that came out was soft, strange, almost musical. Daniel could not understand the words, but he understood the meaning. She was asking for help. He hesitated, his mind racing. This was insane, he thought. An alien, or whatever she was, right here, in the middle of the city. Should he call the police? Should he run? Should he pretend it was all a dream? But when he looked at her again, sitting in the cold alley with trembling hands, his heart softened. Daniel took a slow step forward, careful not to scare her. "It's okay," he said in a calm voice, even though his hands were shaking. "You're safe. I won't hurt you." Of course she couldn't understand his words, but maybe she could understand his tone. The woman tilted her head, blinking at him. For a moment, Daniel thought she might vanish, like a ghost fading into the night. But she stayed, still watching him. Daniel looked around, making sure no one else was nearby. The streets were empty, the city asleep. He knew that if someone else found her, they might not be as kind. They might call the authorities, and then she would be locked away, experimented on, treated like a monster. The thought made his stomach twist. He crouched down slowly, keeping his hands open and visible. "Come with me," he whispered, pointing gently toward his apartment building down the street. She didn't move, just stared at him with wide, glowing eyes. Daniel sighed and tried again, patting his chest, then pointing to himself. "Daniel," he said. "My name is Daniel." Then he pointed at her, waiting, hoping. After a long pause, she touched her chest weakly and whispered something. The sound was soft and broken, but he thought he heard a name. It sounded like Elara. Daniel nodded quickly, smiling nervously. "Elara," he repeated, trying to say it the way she had. For the first time, her lips curved into the faintest smile. It was small, fragile, but it was real. And somehow, that was enough to convince him. He stood up and reached out a hand. At first, she did not react. Then slowly, with trembling fingers, she placed her hand in his. Her skin felt cold but strangely smooth, almost like glass warmed by moonlight. Daniel helped her to her feet, surprised at how light she felt. She swayed slightly, and he held her steady. Together, they stepped out of the alley, walking toward his building. Daniel kept glancing around, terrified someone would see them. But the streets remained empty, and the night was silent, except for the sound of their footsteps. As they walked, Daniel's mind spun with questions. Where had she come from? Why was she here? Was she dangerous? But one thought rose above the others, clear and strong. If he left her out here tonight, she would not survive. And no matter what she was, he couldn't let that happen. When they reached his small apartment door, Daniel hesitated for only a moment. Then he unlocked it and guided her inside. He had no idea what he was starting, but something told him that this one choice, this one act of kindness, would change his life, and maybe the future of humanity, forever. Daniel closed the door behind them and locked it. his hands still trembling. The small apartment felt warmer than usual, but maybe it was just the rush of his heartbeat. He glanced at the alien woman, Elara, standing in the corner like a shadow. Her glowing eyes scanned the room, touching every object with quiet curiosity. She looked out of place, fragile yet strangely powerful, like a storm hidden inside a glass. Daniel tried to steady his voice. "You can sit," he said, pointing toward the old couch. Elara tilted her head, not understanding the words, but she followed his gesture. Slowly, she sat down, her movements careful, as if every step took energy from her. The cushions sank under her light weight, and for the first time Daniel noticed how weak she truly was. He hurried to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. His hands shook so much that a few drops spilled on the counter. When he returned, Elara's glowing eyes watched him closely. Daniel offered the glass and she took it in both hands. She sniffed it first, then drank carefully like every drop mattered. Her throat moved as she swallowed, and when she finished, her shoulders seemed to relax. "Hungry?" Daniel asked softly, opening the fridge. Of course she could not understand, but he pulled out bread and cheese anyway. He placed them on a plate and set it in front of her. Elara leaned closer, studying the food with suspicion. Then she touched the bread gently, broke off a piece and tasted it. Her face lit up with surprise, as if it was the first safe thing she had eaten in days. She ate slowly with care, savoring each bite. Daniel felt relief. At least he could give her this small comfort. While she ate, Daniel sat in the chair opposite her. His eyes never left her, and questions filled his mind. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why was she here, alone and afraid? But he knew asking was useless, not yet. Her language was broken, her words unfamiliar. Still, he hoped there might be a way to understand her. The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that held mystery, like the pause before thunder. Elara finally looked up, her glowing eyes meeting his. She touched her chest again, the same way she had in the alley. "Elara," she whispered, the name soft, but clear. Daniel nodded quickly, repeating it. "Elara." She gave a small nod as if confirming he had said it correctly. Then she pointed at him with a trembling finger, her lips moving carefully. "Neil," she whispered, almost perfect. Daniel's heart skipped. The sound of his own name from her voice felt unreal. It was the first bridge between two worlds, fragile but real. Suddenly, the lamp beside the couch flickered, buzzing with strange energy. Elara glanced at it, almost guilty, and her hand brushed the side of the lamp. The light steadied, glowing brighter than before. Daniel's eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat. She hadn't touched the switch, she hadn't done anything human. It was like the lamp had responded to her presence, to her touch. For the first time, Daniel understood. This woman was not just surviving, she was something far beyond. Fear prickled at the back of his mind. If the world knew about her, they wouldn't see her as a guest, they would see her as a weapon. The thought chilled him, but he pushed it down. Right now, she wasn't a danger. She was simply someone lost, someone in need. He leaned forward and spoke softly. "You're safe here," he said, not knowing if she understood, but his tone carried the promise, and maybe that was enough. The night dragged on, and outside the city grew quieter. Daniel gave her a blanket, and she held it tightly, her silver skin reflecting the warm colors of the fabric. She curled into the couch, eyes half closed but still alert. Daniel sat awake, watching her, his mind restless. This was no dream, no illusion. A stranger from the stars was in his living room, and somehow it felt like the beginning of something much bigger than himself. Sleep finally tugged at his eyes, and he leaned back in his chair. Before he drifted off, he whispered again, almost like a promise to himself. "You're safe here, Elara." And in the faint glow of her eyes, he thought he saw trust forming. Fragile, uncertain, but real. A trust that might decide the fate of both their worlds. The night passed slowly, but Daniel hardly slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he opened them again to check if she was still there. Elara lay curled on the couch, wrapped in the old blanket, her faint glow lighting the room like moonlight. Her breathing was steady, calm, almost human, yet there was something different about it. Daniel felt like he was watching a secret hidden from the entire world. By morning, the city outside was noisy again, but inside the apartment, it was quiet. Daniel stood in the kitchen making coffee, trying to act normal, though nothing was normal anymore. He kept glancing at Elara, wondering what to do next. He couldn't tell anyone, not even his closest friends. They wouldn't believe him, and if they did, they might bring the wrong kind of attention. For now she was his secret and his responsibility. The smell of coffee filled the air and Elara stirred. Her glowing eyes opened slowly, scanning the room like she had forgotten where she was. Then her gaze landed on Daniel, and for a moment there was fear. But when she recognized him, her shoulders relaxed. Daniel raised the cup, smiling nervously. "Coffee," he said, pointing. She tilted her head, not understanding, but she watched carefully as he sipped. He offered her another cup of water instead, and she accepted with a small nod. After drinking, Elara stood, moving slowly around the room. She touched objects with gentle fingers, the bookshelf, the old TV, the broken clock on the wall. When her hand brushed the clock, something strange happened. The second hand, which hadn't moved in months, began ticking again. Daniel froze, the hair on his arms rising. He whispered, "No way," under his breath. But Elara didn't look surprised. She simply stepped back and folded her hands, as if nothing had happened. Daniel's heart pounded. It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. She had fixed the clock without tools, without effort, just by touching it. He thought about the lamp last night, the way it had flickered and then calmed. This wasn't coincidence. She had power. Power he couldn't explain, power that scared him as much as it amazed him. He sat down, running a hand through his hair. "What are you?" he whispered, his voice low and shaky. Elara turned toward him, her eyes glowing brighter. She touched her chest. "Elara," she said softly, repeating her name. Daniel shook his head. "No, I mean, what are you?" Of course she didn't understand, but his question lingered in the room like heavy smoke. The silence stretched until Elara walked closer. She crouched in front of him, her glowing eyes searching his face. Then, slowly, she reached out and touched his hand. A spark ran through his skin, not painful but sharp, like static energy. Images flashed in his mind. Stars, broken ships, fire in the sky, loneliness, endless wandering. Daniel gasped and pulled his hand back, his chest tight. "What? What was that?" he stammered. Elara's face was calm, but her eyes shimmered with sadness. She whispered something in her strange tongue, and though he didn't know the words, he felt the meaning. Loss, pain, exile, and something more. Hope. Daniel sat frozen, his breath shallow. He didn't know if she had just shown him memories or if his mind had imagined it, but it felt real. Too real to ignore. This woman wasn't just lost. She was running from something, carrying the weight of an entire story on her shoulders. The rest of the morning passed in uneasy silence. Daniel tried to distract himself, turning on the TV, flipping through channels, but Elara's eyes followed the screen with strange fascination. When the news showed images of war and destruction, her face hardened. When it showed people laughing, smiling, living ordinary lives, her eyes softened. She seemed to study humans. As if trying to understand them, Daniel wondered, was she judging? Comparing? Deciding something about humanity itself? Later, while Daniel cooked simple eggs and toast, Elara approached the window. She pressed her hand against the glass, watching the people far below. Children ran to school, adults hurried. To work, cars rushed past each other. Her glowing eyes reflected the busy world, a world she didn't belong to. Daniel joined her, standing awkwardly at her side. "That's humanity," he said quietly. "Messy, loud, but it's us." She turned to look at him, her face unreadable, then back to the street. He wondered if she saw weakness or strength, danger or kindness. For the first time, he wasn't sure which was true. When night came again, Daniel felt the weight of his decision pressing harder. Letting her in was one thing, but keeping her here was another. What if someone found out? What if she wasn't safe? What if he wasn't safe? But when he looked at her curled once more on the couch, eyes glowing faintly in the dark, he knew the answer. He couldn't abandon her now. Whatever she was, whatever danger or hope she carried, their fates were already tied together. And deep down, Daniel felt something strange. This wasn't just chance. It was destiny, and it had only just begun. The second night was different. Daniel sat at the table with his head in his hands, his mind spinning like a storm. He could no longer pretend this was just kindness or just luck. Aylara was more than a stranger, more than a guest. She carried something heavy, something far beyond his understanding. Across the room, Aylara sat, quietly on the couch, her glowing eyes fixed on the small lamp beside her. The light bent and shifted as if it was alive, dancing under her gaze. Daniel shivered, the sight both beautiful and terrifying. He whispered under his breath, "Who? Are you really?" This time he needed an answer, not silence. Taking a deep breath, Daniel stood and moved closer. He pointed at himself. "Daniel," then pointed at her. "Aylara." She nodded softly, her silver skin catching the dim light. Daniel repeated the action but added a question, spreading his arms wide. "What are you?" At first she stared in silence, her face unreadable. Then she pressed her hand gently against her chest, her lips forming words he almost understood. Her voice was quiet but filled with weight. "Not human." The words struck Daniel like a hammer. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over the chair. His heart raced, though he already knew the truth. Hearing it was different. "Not human," he repeated, his voice shaky. Aylara gave a slow nod, her glowing eyes locked on his. Daniel tried to calm himself. He sat down again, gripping the edge of the table. "Where from?" he asked, pointing upward to the sky. Aylara followed his gesture and looked toward the ceiling. Beyond it, to the stars. Her face changed, sadness pulling at her features. She whispered a word, long and soft, filled with sorrow. It was not English, not any language Daniel knew, but in that moment he understood. It was the name of her home, her lost world. Suddenly, Aylara stood and walked toward him. Her movements were graceful, almost floating. She reached out and touched his forehead. With her cool fingers, Daniel gasped as visions flooded his mind again. He saw a world covered in silver oceans and tall crystal towers. He saw skies filled with bright ships, glowing trails cutting across the stars. He saw fire, destruction, war, and silence. He felt her pain, her loneliness, her escape. Then, in a blink, it was gone. Daniel leaned back, breathless, sweat on his forehead. His voice cracked as he whispered, You showed me." Aylara lowered her hand, her face calm but heavy with sorrow. "Alone," she said softly, the word broken but clear. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. "You're the last?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Aylara nodded, slowly. "Alone," she repeated, her voice like a fading echo. The room fell silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. Daniel's chest tightened, the weight of her story pressing down on him. This wasn't just about helping a stranger. This was about carrying the last voice of a vanished people. And now that voice was sitting in his apartment, trusting him. Aylara moved back to the couch and unwrapped the blanket from her lap. From within its folds, she pulled out something small. Glowing faintly, Daniel leaned forward, his eyes wide. It was a crystal, clear and sharp, humming with quiet energy. The air around it seemed to vibrate, filling the room with a strange calm. She held it gently in both hands, like it was alive. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Gift." Daniel stared, his mind racing. The crystal pulsed softly, almost like a heartbeat. What does it do? He asked, though he wasn't sure if he wanted the answer. Aylara looked at him, her glowing eyes reflecting the crystal's light. She pressed it against the broken clock on the wall. The crack vanished. The glass healed. The ticking grew louder, stronger. Then she held it near a dying plant on the windowsill. The leaves straightened, color returned. Life bloomed in seconds. Daniel's jaw dropped, his body frozen in disbelief. This is impossible, he whispered. Aylara shook her head slowly. Possible, she answered, her voice calm. Daniel's thoughts spiraled. If this crystal could fix, heal, restore, what else could it do? Food, medicine, energy, the whole world could change, but he also knew deep down it could destroy everything if it fell into the wrong hands. He looked at Aylara, fear and wonder mixing in his eyes. You're trusting me with this? He asked quietly. Aylara tilted her head, studying him carefully. Finally, she whispered, choice. The word echoed in his chest like a bell, heavy and final. It wasn't just her story anymore. It was his too. And the choice he made next could decide the fate of humanity itself. The crystal rested in Aylara's hands, glowing softly like a living star. Daniel could not take his eyes off it. It was beautiful, almost hypnotic, yet terrifying at the same time. He felt like he was staring at something humans were never meant to hold. Something too powerful, too ancient, too dangerous. Aylara looked at him with steady eyes, her voice soft but clear. Gift. The word echoed in his head like a warning and a promise. Daniel shook his head slowly, his chest tight. A gift? For me? He whispered. Aylara tilted her head, her silver hair falling across her glowing face. Not for you. For all, she said, her words broken but sharp enough to cut through his doubt. Daniel leaned closer, his eyes wide. What does it do? He asked, his voice trembling. Aylara glanced at the crystal, then back at him. She lifted it high, and the air in the room seemed to hum louder. The light bulb above them grew brighter without power. The broken radio on the shelf crackled and began to play static. The dying plant in the corner straightened again, blooming with green life. Everywhere the crystal touched, decay became strength, and silence became energy. Daniel's jaw dropped, his hands trembling. This is impossible, he whispered. Aylara shook her head gently. Possible, she replied, her glowing eyes steady. Daniel tried to imagine what this meant. If this crystal could heal, repair, give life, then humanity's greatest problems could vanish overnight. No hunger, no sickness, no fuel shortages, no wars over energy. It was hope shaped into a single shard of light, but even as the thought filled him, another voice in his head screamed louder. If governments saw this, they would fight for it, kill for it, destroy for it. Wars would be started not to end hunger, but to own the weapon that could end it. He saw the greed of corporations, the hunger of armies, the endless thirst for control. The crystal would not save humanity. It would divide. He clenched his fists, his mind torn between wonder and dread. Aylara must have sensed his fear. She stepped closer, holding out the crystal for him to see more clearly. Her voice was calm, but heavy with warning. Danger, she whispered. Choice. Daniel met her glowing eyes, his breath caught in his throat. You mean, it could destroy us as much as it could save us, he said quietly. Aylara gave a slow nod, her silence confirming his fear. Daniel stood and paced the room, his heart racing. He thought of the headlines, of the panic, of the riots. He thought of the scientists who would try to cut the crystal apart, the armies that would weaponize it. And then he thought of the children in hospitals, the starving families, the sick, the poor. He thought of what good could be done if the crystal was in the right hands. It was too much, far too much for one person to decide. Yet Aylara was looking at him, waiting, as if he was the only one who could answer. Why me? Daniel whispered. his voice breaking. There are leaders, scientists, people who know more than me. Why give it to me? Elara's eyes softened, and for the first time, her voice carried a warmth like kindness. Because you gave me water, she said slowly, her broken words cutting deeper than any explanation. Daniel froze, his chest tightening. She was right. He had not treated her like a monster, or a weapon, or a tool. He had treated her like a person, and that was why she trusted him. He sank back into the chair, running his hands over his face. This was bigger than anything he could handle, yet he could not walk away. The crystal pulsed in Elara's hands like a heartbeat. Steady and patient, it was waiting, like she was, for him to decide. The night grew darker, the city outside buzzing with normal life. Cars passed, people laughed, unaware that inside this small apartment, a choice was being weighed that could change everything. Daniel stared at the crystal until his eyes burned. He imagined a world healed, a world alive, a world thriving. Then he imagined a world at war, torn apart by greed, fire, and endless hunger for power. Both futures lay inside. That glowing shard finally, he whispered almost too softly to hear. If humanity is to change, it has to be us. All of us, not just the powerful. Elara leaned forward, listening, her glowing eyes reflecting his determination. Daniel's voice grew firmer. If this is shared, it has to belong to everyone, not governments, not armies, not kings. For the first time, Elara's lips curved into a small but certain smile. She nodded once slowly, her voice a whisper of agreement. All. Daniel knew then that the gift was real, but it was also a test. And the test was not of the crystal's power, but of humanity's heart. He didn't know if they were ready. He didn't know if they deserved it, but he knew one thing. He would not let the wrong hands decide. This was bigger than fear, bigger than him. This was the future, glowing in the dark, waiting to be chosen. Daniel sat in silence, staring at the glowing crystal in Elara's hands. It pulsed with soft light, steady and calm, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. The entire room seemed alive with its energy, the air, warmer, the shadows softer, but inside Daniel's chest there was no calm, only storm. He knew a choice had to be made, and it terrified him. Elara's eyes never left his face, glowing with quiet patience. She did not push him, did not speak. She simply waited. It was as if she already knew the weight of the decision was his alone. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice breaking. What happens if I give this to the wrong people? He whispered. Images flashed in his mind, armies marching, bombs dropping, greed consuming cities. He shook his head, his stomach twisting. They'd destroy everything. Elara tilted her head, her silver hair catching the faint light. Choice, she said softly, her voice carrying a strange strength despite its broken English. Daniel's hands trembled as he rubbed his face. He was just an ordinary man, no leader, no hero, just a guy who worked a dull job and went home to a small apartment. Why should he decide the fate of humanity? Why him, and not someone wiser, stronger, or smarter? But then he remembered her words, the reason she trusted him. Because you gave me water, she had said. Not because he had power or money or authority, but because he had shown kindness when no one else would. Daniel realized the truth. Sometimes the right choice did not belong to the powerful. Sometimes it belonged to the ordinary, the overlooked, the forgotten, because they knew what it meant to have nothing and still choose to give. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the glowing city. Cars rushed, people hurried, neon lights flickered across the streets. So much life, so much chaos, so much beauty. Humanity was flawed, yes, but also capable of love, of creation, of wonder. Daniel pressed his forehead to the cool glass, whispering, "Are we ready for this?" Behind him, Elara's voice came soft but certain. "Not ready, but must." Daniel turned, his heart pounding at her words, She understood the risk as much as he did, yet she still believed. She was giving humanity a chance, even after losing her own people. That faith shook him to his core. If someone who had lost everything could still believe in humanity, maybe he could too. He returned to the table, sitting across from her. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice low, desperate. Ilara leaned closer, holding the crystal between them. Her glowing eyes locked on his. "Share," she whispered. "All people." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. "All people. Not leaders, not armies," he repeated. She nodded once, her expression calm, almost peaceful. The idea was insane, yet it was the only way. If the crystal's knowledge was given freely, to everyone at once, no one could hoard it. It would belong to humanity as a whole, not a single group. It was dangerous, but it was fair. It was hope spread like light, impossible to cage. Daniel's chest rose and fell as he made his decision. He whispered to himself, "This is it. No turning back." Ilara placed the crystal in his hands, its energy humming against his skin. He felt warmth rush through him, not just physical, but something deeper. Visions flickered in his mind, fields of food, clean energy, healed children, but also fire, riots, conflict. The crystal was neither good nor evil. It was a mirror of those who used it. The choice wasn't about the crystal, it was about humanity. Daniel closed his eyes, gripping it tightly. For the first time, he wasn't afraid. He knew the risk. He knew the danger, but he also knew the potential. Humanity had to be trusted, even if it failed, even if it stumbled, because without trust, there was no future. When he opened his eyes, Ilara was watching him closely. Her faint smile told him she already knew his decision. Daniel's voice was steady now, no longer trembling. "We share it with everyone," he said firmly. "No secrets, no rulers, no chains." Ilara nodded slowly, her glowing eyes soft with relief. She whispered one word, filled with hope. "Together." The crystal pulsed brighter. As if it had heard the decision, Daniel felt the weight lift slightly from his shoulders, replaced by resolve. He did not know how the world would react, he did not know what would come next, but he knew one thing with certainty. The choice had been made, and there was no going back. The future of humanity had already begun to change, and he was standing at the center of it, holding the spark of tomorrow in his hands. The crystal pulsed brightly in Daniel's hands as if alive. Its light filled the small apartment, chasing away every shadow. Ilara stood close, her glowing eyes fixed on him, calm, but waiting. This was the moment everything would change, and Daniel knew it. He set the crystal on the table, its hum steady like the sound of a heartbeat. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice trembling. Ilara stepped forward and touched the surface of the glowing shard. The light rippled outward, flowing into her hands, then into the air. Symbols appeared, lines of strange energy hanging in the room like holograms. Daniel gasped, staring at the floating patterns, shapes that looked like blueprints, codes, instructions. They weren't just alien. They were knowledge, meant to be shared. Ilara looked at him, her voice soft. "All people." Daniel nodded, understanding at once. She wasn't asking him to guard the crystal. She was asking him to release it. The designs, the power, the knowledge. Everything had to be given freely. Not to rulers, not to governments, but to the world itself. His hands shook as he pulled out his old laptop. He placed it on the table and opened it, the screen glowing weakly. The internet connection was slow, but it was enough. Ilara leaned closer, her silver fingers brushing the keyboard. The floating symbols shifted, pouring into the computer. Lines of alien code turned into simple designs, schematics, clear instructions anyone could follow. Daniel watched in awe as files filled the screen. Machines that produced energy, tools that healed wounds, devices that grew food from air and water. The crystal wasn't just power, it was a library of solutions, a gift of survival. Daniel's heart pounded as he clicked the button to upload. He posted the files everywhere, Forums, social media, public databases, anywhere people could see. It was unstoppable now, spreading across the internet faster than fire in dry grass. Once shared, it could never be taken back. The gift now belonged to everyone, to humanity itself. Ilara's eyes softened, and for the first time she smiled fully. It was small, but filled with relief, like a burden lifted after centuries. Daniel sat back, his chest heavy, but calm. "It's done," he whispered. "The choice is made." Outside, the city continued as normal at first, unaware of what had just begun. But within hours, people across the world found the designs. At first, there was confusion, disbelief, laughter. Then came experiments, small tests, and then gasps of shock as the devices actually worked. Water purifiers that produced endless clean water, small generators that lit entire homes without fuel, medical devices that healed wounds in minutes. The world began to change piece by piece faster than anyone could stop. The news exploded with headlines. Some leaders tried to claim the technology for themselves, but it was too late. It was everywhere, copied, shared, impossible to hide. For the first time in history, humanity held something no single person could control, a gift too vast to be chained. Daniel sat by the window that night. Watching the city lights, he felt fear, but also something stronger, hope. The world would not change overnight, he knew that. There would still be greed, still be fighting, still be doubt. But now, there was also a chance. A real chance. Ilara stood beside him, silent, watching the stars. Her people were gone, but her gift lived on, carried by humans. Daniel turned to her, his voice low. "Why me? Why trust humanity at all?" Ilara's eyes glowed softly as she whispered, "Because one man opened his door." The words sank deep into Daniel's chest, simple but eternal. It hadn't been fate. It hadn't been destiny. It had been a choice, a small act of kindness that grew into something far greater. The days turned into weeks and the world shifted. Food grew in deserts, lights burned in villages once forgotten. Children who had been sick began to heal. Families once broken began to hope. Not all problems vanished, but the balance of power began to change. People realized the truth, that they had been given a second chance, and through it all, Daniel kept Ilara safe in his small apartment. She was no longer just a guest, no longer just a stranger. She was the bridge between two worlds, the last voice of her people and the first spark of a new humanity. Every night, they would sit by the window, looking at the stars, and Daniel would wonder if her people could see them now. Proud of what she had done, the crystal still glowed faintly on the table, but it was no longer a secret. It was a seed planted across the earth, growing in every corner, and though the future was uncertain, one truth could never be undone. Humanity had been changed forever, because one man let a homeless alien stay the night. And what she gave in return was not just power, but hope. Hope strong enough to light the stars.